Episode 35, September the 17th, 1914, German White Flag Treachery. I Shall Never Forget It, by Captain E.J. Needham, read by Michael Charter. During the confused fighting on the Aisne, Captain Needham, who was with the 1st Northamptonshire Regiment 48th Foot, had the shattering experience of seeing a fellow officer shot down while parleying with the Germans who were showing the white flag. He gives a most vivid account of the incident. In answer to the question, was this outrage deliberate, he answers, "We shall never know." Thursday, September the 17th was a stormy one for the 48th, as many more days were to be during the next 4 years. C Company were in reserve, the 3 other companies being in the front line. The morning passed fairly quietly, except for the usual shelling of the village allotments. But about 1:30 p.m. the Germans launched an attack on our lines in pouring rain and considerable strength. C Company were ordered up to reinforce to the right of the line and to launch a counterattack. We fell in quickly and doubled along the terrace to the point where the high bank between us and the front line levelled off, just opposite the right flank of A Company, the flank company of the battalion. Here we turned to the left and advanced, still at the double, in extended order. We reached the road, Chemin de Dames, and lay down there for a few minutes to get our breath. Then Paker, OC of the company, gave the order to fix bayonets and a few minutes later to charge. Over the low bank we went, Paker shouting, "Come on, the cobblers," and the men cheering like hell. I ran as hard and best I could over the roots, with my sword drawn in one hand and my revolver in the other, stumbling over and cursing the roots and expecting every movement to be tripped up by my sword scabbard. We charged through heavy rifle and machine gun fire, and men were dropping off in every direction. We got to 30 yards from the trench, which we had passed over the Monday of September the 14th, and which we now strongly held. By now, everyone was pretty well blown, and I was thankful when I saw the whole line to my right throwing themselves down flat. I shouted "Down" to my men, and suited the action to the word. In any case, nobody could have heard me over the appalling din. We lay where we were for some considerable time, keeping up a steady fire at the trench ahead of us. We were well sprinkled with shrapnel all the time, and again, owing to the rain and misty conditions, were getting practically no artillery support from our guns. I remember vividly a man behind me letting off his rifle in my right ear and deafening me for a long time. He must have had just missed blowing my head off. Now it was, and for the next hour or so, that I found how difficult it is to command one's own men under active service conditions. To control fire with an extended firing line was absolutely impossible. I shouted until I was hoarse, and could just not make myself heard above the firing. The line was now at a standstill, and looked remaining so. The only thing to do appeared to be to keep our fire up, and take what cover we could in the roots. After what seemed hours, I saw young Gordon, a fellow subaltern, crawling along on his tummy towards me from the right flank of the company. He eventually reached me and told me that poor old Paker had been killed leading the charge, and I was in command of the company and also the company of the 60th Rifles on our right, all of whose officers had been either killed or wounded. I was horrified to hear of Parker's death, and also my position. Gordon and I lay down together for some time debating as to what on earth we should do. We decided to try to get the line on and rush to the trench. We passed messages down to each flank to tell everyone to be prepared to renew the charge when we blew our whistles and started. But when we did blow them as loud and as long as we could and started forward, with the men next to us who had got the message correctly, the hostile fire broke out again, stronger than ever, and as the rest of the line had not budged an inch, down we went again. We could see a group of people back in the road in the direction from where we'd come, and I asked for a volunteer to take a message back to the CO. A man next to me volunteered, and I wrote out a message in my field service notebook to say that Parker had been killed, that I understood all officers of the 60th were casualties, and that we were held up, and asking for orders. The man crawled off, and presently we saw him running down the hill to the road. After about 10 minutes, he came back with a written message telling me to hold on till further orders and to keep up my fire as much as possible. This was continued for another hour or so. Then suddenly I heard the shouting. They're surrendering. I saw a line of white flags, or rather white handkerchiefs or something of the kind, tied to the muzzles of rifles, held up all along the German trench in front of us, right away to the left. I shouted out to the man to cease fire and stop where they were. After a few minutes I saw a large number of Germans, 200 or 300 at least, moving forward from the trench towards A Company on the road, some with their rifles, but many with white flags tied to them, and many with their hands up. They got down to A Company trench and stood there for some time, apparently conversing. All this time the white flags in front of us continued up, and many Germans were standing with their hands up. All of a sudden a burst of heavy firing broke out down by A Company's trench, and we saw the Germans and our men engaged in a hand-to-hand fight. Still the white flags in front of us remained up. Just as Gordon and myself had decided to reopen fire and to chance whether we were right or wrong, I saw Captain J.A. Savage of D Company and Lieutenant J.H.S. Dimmer of the 60th walk through the left of C Company and on up to the German trench in front of me. Apparently they could talk German. Anyway, they stayed there talking for about 5 minutes and then started to walk back to us, their white flags still being up. To our horror, after they got about halfway to us, the Germans opened fire on them, and we saw Savage pitch forward dead, shot in the back. Dimmer threw himself down and started to crawl back to us, eventually reaching our lines all right. Dimmer won the VC later in the war and was eventually killed. During all this white flag episode, Gordon and I had been kneeling up, trying to make out what was going on, and were still doing so when the Huns opened fire on Savage and Dimmer. Gordon, who was not a foot away from me, suddenly pitched forward on his face and yelled out, "Oh my God, I'm hit." He writhed about on the ground in agony, and I tried to keep him quiet, while at the same time trying to watch Dimmer and what was going on down the line. He assured me again and again that he was shot through the stomach and that he was going to die. Poor devil, it was hell, being able to do nothing for him and to see him in such agony. I could only try to reassure him. The scrap down by A Company was still going on, and by now we were also firing on the Germans opposite as hard as we could, having reopened fire as soon as Dimmer got safely back to us. Then to our joy we heard the tap-tap-tap of a machine gun behind us, and saw a machine gun detachment, that of the 1st Queen's as we afterwards learned, fairly lacing into the Germans in the front of A Company, who started to bolt back into their own trench. Very few got back. However, there were those not mown down, the machine gun firing at 150 yards range, being finished off by the infuriated remnants of about 70 men of A Company. We redoubled our own fire, and after about quarter of an hour later we'd up the white flag again in front of us, to which we paid no attention whatsoever. Young Gordon's Batman had volunteered to go back and get some stretcher bearers up, and presently they arrived, and we got poor Gordon onto the stretcher. He made me promise to see that his sword was sent back to his family, and his Batman took it. They carried him off, and I never saw him again, poor boy. He died at the casualty clearing station the next day, having suffered terribly, and was buried there. A typical cheery, plucky boy straight from Sandhurst, gazetted only that January, to whom everybody had taken a great fancy and whom I personally liked. By now all the firing from the German trenches stopped, though intermittent shrapnel still continued, and it was getting pretty dark. Dimmer, who had taken over the command of the company of the 60th, and who was senior to me, now passed word along to advance, take the trench, and any Germans still in it. Accordingly we advanced and found the trench full of dead and dying Germans. 3 or 4 badly wounded men got up and put their hands up. I went up to them and pointed my revolver at them, signalled to them to go down towards the road. They shambled off quickly enough, and I sent some men down with them. We then, with the men of the 60th, proceeded to fill in the German trench, burying the dead, all of us furious and embittered at having seen Savage and Gordon killed under the white flag like that. Having finished this unpleasant job, we got orders to retire to the road, which we proceeded to do. On arriving, we found the Colonel, Major Norman, and Guy Robinson, and Guy comes up to me and says, "You old devil, you must have had a hell of a time in and out there, but you did well." This kind of greeting cheered me up, and I was feeling just about all in. Being wet through to the skin, chilled to the bone, and nerve-wracked after having one of my very best friends, Parker, killed, in having poor young Gordon practically killed beside me, and seeing poor old Savage butchered in that foul style. Also, the whole show had been such an awful muddle, and I was terrified of having done the wrong thing. I shall never forget that afternoon till my dying day, nor the horror and the uncertainty of it. I can remember quite clearly today every incident connected with it, and I always shall. The white flag incident, as I've related it as I saw it and can see it now. To this day it is a mystery to me. Did the Germans really mean to surrender? But on getting down to A Company to do so and finding so few men there, perhaps changed their minds and tried to reverse the proceedings and take them prisoner? Or was the whole thing a put-up job? We shall never know. I shall also now give hereafter the version of Second Lieutenant L.H.B. Bolton, who commanded the detachment of A Company concerned and given in the regimental war history, which fully bears out the appalling muddle that ensued. To our outstanding joy, we saw the enemy in front of us making signs of surrender by putting up their hands. Their fire stopped, and I ordered my men to do likewise. I stood up on the parapet and called for the officer to meet me. An individual, I think a private who spoke English, responded to the call, and I went out some 40 yards ahead of my trench to make the necessary arrangements. On finding out that this was not an officer, I ordered him to return and tell his officer to replace him. A sergeant or under-officer next turned up, but was also returned as not wanted, after which an officer did materialize. He appeared to find great difficulty in understanding me. I agreed to accept the surrender, but as a preliminary thereto, naturally ordered him to make his men lay down their arms. Our conversation took place halfway between the opposing trenches, and to my annoyance, I saw a large number of the enemy detached from the trenches before arrangements were completed. Many of them had their rifles, and many had not, and many had their hands up. I tried to make the Boche officer understand that I could make my men fire if they continued to advance with their arms. All this time the enemy continued to advance, and the officer appeared quite willing to surrender, but unable to grasp any idea of the men putting their rifles down as a preliminary. I found myself being surrounded by the advancing Germans, and as there was no officer in our trench, and Jarvis was in a state of concussion and non-effective, I could not afford to remain out in no man's land, which was rapidly being overwhelmed by the advancing Huns. I was at the time quite sure of their bona fide aim to surrender, and did not want to open fire for two reasons. I do not know how far I calculated these reasons at the time, but their validity was certainly in my mind. First, I thought it was a bona fide surrender, as many of the enemy came without arms and with their hands up. And to make the illusion complete, some of them who were armed handed their rifles over to some of our Tommies who had come out to meet them on their own. It would have been a dirty business to have opened fire on the men who were advancing with their arms because they did not understand English. Secondly, I had a message delivered verbally to me by one of my men from the general: "Do not fire." I remember the message most distinctly. Its incongruity did not strike me at the time, and I thought it a genuine one. It came down from the right of our line, from a quarter in front of where the enemy had also put up their hands. By this time, I was back on the top of my trench with the Boche officers and the under-officer, the Huns, about 400 strong, already amongst us, and in many cases surrendering their arms to Thomas Atkins, and being warmly shaken by the hand. This situation, however, passed very quickly, for one of the Germans quite close to me shot one of my men dead, and the officer, on my saying that if he did not order an immediate cessation of fire, I would order mine to open fire, informed me then I was his prisoner. We then all got to in earnest, so to speak, and at point-blank range, of course. No accuracy of shooting was necessary. The men used their butts and their bayonets lustily. We were, however, far outnumbered, being some 70-odd against, I believe, 400. Then the most wonderful thing happened. The Queens, I think, on our right, seeing we were in trouble, and seeing that the Boche were, for the most part, standing on our parapet and firing down on us in the road, turned on their machine gun, and the spectacle was one never to be forgotten. They fairly enfiladed the Hun on the parapet, and the execution can only be compared to that of a harvesting machine as it mows down the wheat. A regular lane was cut. These Boche on their side of the lane, perhaps some 100 strong, made their best pace back to their trenches. Those on the side of the lane threw down arms and surrendered, but we declined their offer, and in fact, I think only kept one prisoner, a souvenir, no doubt.
I go.